One of the most sought-after fugitives from U.S. authorities has been living for the past several years. Assata Shakur, also known as Joanne Chesimard, convicted and sentenced in the 1973 slaying of a New Jersey state trooper. 2 years into that prison sentence, she broke out of prison, eluded a massive police dragnet, and somehow got here to Cuba, where she's been granted political asylum. But even before that terrible shooting incident, Assata was being watched by police because of her deep involvement in the radical fringe of the civil rights era of the 1960s. She was a member of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army. Yet, her beginnings were far from radical. Attended a mostly white public school in Flushing, Queens. Attended a Catholic high school. Went out and got a job. And then enrolled in a community college to enhance her earning power. Now, up to this point, most anyone would say, so far, so good. But then she became radicalized, and after 2 tumultuous decades, ends up here in Cuba with U.S. authorities itching to get to her. How did this woman move to this from such modest beginnings? In this 90-minute special edition, you'll see our exclusive interview with Ms. Shakur in Cuba, followed by a discussion about Ms. Shakur with persons who were also active in the black struggle of that period, although in different ways. We'll get started in just a moment. During our short stay in Havana. At the site of the old fort overlooking Havana's main harbor that offers a commanding view of Havana's waterfront, and on the campus of the University of Havana. Over a period of several days, she unwound her story that we have edited for continuity. She told us that her given name was Joanne Deborah Byron, and as stated, her early life was pretty much average, right through her late teens, where she graduated from high school and got a job. But then she enrolled in college and underwent a major change here.
I was in Manhattan Community College about maybe 2 weeks before I discovered the Golden Drum Society, which was the black organization on campus. And it was like an awakening. Here were these black people, and they were talking about dashikis in Africa and the richness of Africa. And I was like, huh? You know, I had just come out of this office mentality of, you know, of feeling like a servant and feeling that that was my role to, you know, type the papers. And I mean, and I went back to school basically so I could make more money. That was really why I went back. I didn't go back with any desire to learn or to explore. I went back to survive. And when I got there and I saw that there was another, that life was way beyond the file cabinets and the typewriters, that there was more, and that here were these black people who were into studying, who were into just talking about what was happening, talking about the war, talking about talking about what all of this meant, trying to analyze it with a kind of energy that was good, that was strong, that was rich, and I just got into it. I mean, it just was like, sucked me in like a vacuum cleaner. I was there and it was good. It made me feel alive.
We're talking about the civil rights era of the 1960s now, where the black struggle against injustice was in full swing. The old order of segregation and bias was being subjected to a massive and varied challenge. Dr. King's tactics of passive resistance were viewed as radical at the time. And then black students formed their own faction, which was similar to Dr. King's approach initially, with the special aggressive energy of youth.
We were the troops. We were the people who went to Selma 2 years before Dr. King ever saw that town. We were the people who went into rural Mississippi when the NAACP told us it was too dangerous, that you had to attack Mississippi from the outside, not from the inside. We were the people who, working for $10 a week, went all over the rural South in extremely dangerous circumstances, risking life and limb, going to jail, being beaten, harassed by policemen, not eating right, not having any clothes to wear. And I think, without trying to be too modest, that we were the glue that held all of this movement together. Dr. King was the articulator and the spokesman. The SCLC workers became the instant organizers, go into a town, spend a couple of weeks, stir up emotion and passion, bring in Dr. King, makes a speech, have a march, out the next day. We were there for the long haul.
There was the NAACP fighting the battle through the courts, the Urban League fighting the fight with corporate America, and a host of other civil rights groups.
The thing that influenced me the most was history, reading and understanding that black people struggled in history from Africa all the way up to the time that I was living in. It was not a process where people were enslaved and went through that whole thing as victims, that our people had a long, rich, strong history, an intellectual history, a history of struggling from taking over slave ships to strikes, to building organizations, and that was a history that was not just a matter of George Washington Carver inventing things with peanuts. And I don't mean to push him down because I think he made a great contribution, but I'm saying that that was all that I had learned before that. The only figure who had stood out was Harriet Tubman, you know, and it was Harriet Tubman, George Washington Carver, and Booker T. Washington. That was my whole concept, my whole understanding of black history up until that time. And I really thought that Lincoln freed the slaves. I really thought that the Civil War was fought for slavery. And when I started to see the real picture of what happened to us as a people and really started to analyze what American history was all about, I began to look at things in a whole nother way and to see that, you know, it was a systemized, that this place called America had, the U.S. of A. had systematically wiped out Indians, had systematically enslaved black people, and then after slavery was officially abolished, that the oppression didn't end. It just changed form.
Joanne, as she was then known, underwent an awakening that thousands of young Americans, black and white, underwent at the time. As she became more informed, she became a highly charged young person. The next logical step was to become active.
We formed a Third World Coalition, and we ran for, in the student council elections, I was one of the student representatives. That was one part of it. And then I started to be one, to just participate in demonstrations, whether anything. If it, you know, I mean, we would just get these groups, and if somebody's got got a strike on 116th Street, and the whole pile of us would just go and we'd help the people that were on strike, or we'd and we supported all kinds of things, from construction workers who were struggling to break that racist structure.
Fight back.
Fight back. We did housing stuff. We participated in housing demonstrations and struggles around Morningside Heights. There were welfare strikes. There were, not strikes, but welfare movements and rallies. And there was the anti-war movement, which was an important phase in my development, because I began to understand not just what was going on in the States as something that just stayed in the States, but that the kind of homegrown oppression that black people and third world people in the U.S. experienced was being exported, and was exported to Vietnam, was exported to Central America, that was exported to Africa, that this was all part and parcel of the same ballgame, the same deal. That it was like a kind of concerted effort to just, you know, maintain a status quo that kept a small group of people in the jet set, and a huge number of people in a state of perpetual crash, a perpetual hunger, a perpetual unemployment, a perpetual misery. And I don't say that I got all of that together at that time in one piece, but it started to really change my picture of the world.
The student faction of the movement was now moving beyond desegregating lunch counters and public facilities. They were now challenging this nation's political process. For example, by attempting to include blacks in the Mississippi delegation to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City in 1964. Young people were challenging U.S. businesses operating in black areas. The challenge was to give jobs to blacks and ancillary business to blacks. Operation Breadbasket had heavy student involvement, and young Jesse Jackson headed up the Chicago chapter and began attracting media attention.
We're militarily occupied by white police. The economic order is controlled by the whites. The chain stores, the private stores, we are colonized people. That's the real violence to us. By the time you see riots, which is considered violence in the streets, that is a reaction, that is a consequence to the causes of the deeper violence done upon our persons every day that we exist.
Assata expanded her scope of activities in the civil rights movement beyond her campus affiliations.
And at that time it was easy because there was so much activity going on. I mean, in the black community there was so much happening, you know, each day. You could plug into something, you could check something out. And what I did at first was to really try to check out different organizations. I checked out Garvey organizations, I checked out so many little community organizations looking for, you know, a way that I could contribute and looking for some way to participate in our struggle on a long-term basis.
Assata went on to tell me that she shopped around for an activist organization to join and selected one of the most radical, as you'll learn in a moment. Some quarters encountered countless incidents of brutal white resistance.
What you're really trying to do is intimidate these people, and by making them stand in the raid, keep them from registering to vote. And this is the kind of violation of the Constitution, the violation of the court order, the violation of decent citizenship. You can turn your back on me, but you cannot turn your back upon the idea of justice. Beat us? Get out of here. You don't have to beat us, arrest us. Get out. Arrest us if we're wrong, don't beat us. Get out. If we're wrong, arrest us, but don't beat us. Stand up.
Some in the North began saying that it wasn't fair to ask black people not to defend themselves when attacked.
We are faced with a racialistic society, a society in which they are deceitful, deceptive, and the only way we can bring about a change is to talk the kind of language, speak the language that they understand. The racialist never understands a peaceful language. The racialist never understands the nonviolent language. The racialist, he's spoken his language to us for 400 years. We have been the victim of his brutality. We are the ones who face his dogs that tear the flesh from our limbs, only because we want to enforce the Supreme Court decision. We are the ones who have our skulls crushed, not by the Ku Klux Klan, but by policemen, only because we want to enforce what they call the Supreme Court decision. We are the ones upon whom water hoses are turned with pressure so hard that it rips the clothes from our backs. Not men, but the clothes from the backs of women and children. You've seen it yourself. Only because we want to enforce what they call the law. Well, anytime you live in a society supposedly based upon law, and it doesn't enforce its own law because the color of a man's skin happens to be wrong, then I say those people are justified to resort to any means necessary to bring about justice where the government can't give them justice.
The struggle for inclusion of Mississippi blacks in the political process at the Democratic National Convention was rebuffed. And Mississippi police in many instances exacted heavy reprisals against some blacks who had engaged in that struggle.
He said, "You are from rural." And he called me an awful name. And he said, "Get up, fatso, and we gonna make you wish you was dead." And I was led out of that cell into another cell where they had 2 black prisoners. The state highway patrolman gave the first black prisoner a blackjack, and it was loaded with some kind of metal. And he ordered me to lay down on my face. The state highway patrolman did. The prisoner asked him, said, "Do you want me to beat this woman with this?" And he told him, say, "You damn right. If you don't beat her, say, you know what we'll do for you." So the first prisoner, started beating. And I was really beaten because he had to do what they told him to do.
From there, when we came back to Mississippi, SNCC had a staff meeting. It had to decide clearly. The organization was at a juncture. We certainly couldn't follow this because we couldn't come back to the people and tell them try again next 4 years to be seated in the Democratic Party. We certainly couldn't do that. We couldn't do that. So we had to find new approaches. There was only one. Organize the people into their own independent political party. Struggle for the right to vote, get the right to vote, coalesce the political power, use this political power to move to make economic gains for the people, fight against the Democratic Party. That was all. So while I went alone, I had the support of a lot of our brothers and sisters who took this position and recognized that inside of SNCC, some people were trying to make sure that the project was a failure. So we had to fight inside of SNCC against those who were trying to make it a failure. We had to fight against the Democratic Party, which did everything possible to sabotage it. We had to fight against Wallace. We had to fight against the Ku Klux Klan. We had to fight against all the liberals who were once liberals, but now were telling us, don't get out the Democratic Party. This is the stupidest thing you could do, and who did everything possible, and though they tried, they crushed, they did everything they couldn't stop the people. They organized an independent political party, and they gave it the symbol of the Black Panther.
I joined the Black Panther Party. That was what I decided to do, and I thought that was important.
Well, now, there are those, if they had the opportunity to talk with you, might say, well, my heavens, why wouldn't you pick the NAA or SNCC or CORE or the League, Urban League, or why go for the Black Panther Party? What was it about the Panthers that drew you?
Well, I think, first of all, because I had already, by the time I joined the Black Panther Party, I had already begun to see that it was not a question of reform, that I basically had come to the conclusion that on every level, the U.S. government was an oppressive system run by and for rich people, and that there was no way that that was going to change because the whole system was based on oppression. That was how I felt, so that I was not interested in joining an organization that was interested in reforms, that was struggling for reforms. I wanted to join an organization, number one, that believed that the whole thing had to be changed, because that was what I believed. Number two, the Black Panther Party...
Not reformed, but replaced.
Yeah, that a complete change, which is a revolution, had to occur, that you could not be free under a system based on racism, based on oppression, based on capitalism, based on imperialism, that nobody in the world can reform a system like that. It's never been done in history, and I don't think it will ever be done in history. So that, to me, that was the most important reason why I joined the Black Panther Party.
Did you find that membership in the Panther Party helped you realize...
Well,
Or was it moving in the direction that you perceived that it was?
Well, actually, I had worked with the Black Panther Party before I joined it. And I had some problems with the style of work. I had problems with the type of rhetoric, with a kind of like macho, with you don't relate to the Black Panther Party style. Well, you know, I mean, it was that kind of thing. And I really liked another kind of style. Although I like a respectful, quiet way of relating to our people, of explaining things. And I didn't like that style. And I thought that sometimes it conspired against things that we were doing. And that I felt that that kind of, I guess, arrogant, macho kind of style was not good for day-to-day organizing in the black community. But at the same time, some events happened that made me really feel that, number one, the party, or any party, was as strong as the people that are in it, and that I felt that even though I had different problems with different things, that essentially I agreed with the 10-point program and platform.
Better housing, better education, a better dispensation of justice, better medical attention. We wanted black men to be exempted from the draft, military service in the war in Indochina. We wanted an end to the exploitation of the black community by white capitalists. Later on, we just said capitalists, right? We wanted an end to police brutality and the murder of black people by the police. That was point number 7. It turned out that we really didn't have time for anything but point number 7, because once we implemented that particular point by patrolling the community, and when the cops would come in their cars, and we would get behind them in our cars, and we would be armed, and when they stopped someone, we'd stop and get out of our car, and the law said that you had to stand 10 feet away, and we would stand 10 feet away, and if the cops got our line, then we got our line, and if they started shooting, then we started shooting. Because we didn't feel that there was any more room for playing around with the situation.
The willingness of some Panther Party members to confront the police and engage in other shocking acts, such as walking in on the California State Legislative Session carrying rifles, negated everything else the group was trying to do. The Panthers were kept under police surveillance, and members like Assata Shakur found it increasingly difficult to conduct their other community programs.
Strange things began to happen around me that I couldn't put my hand on, I couldn't touch, you know.
Like?
Well, so many strange things would happen. We would get strange phone calls, strange packages, strange people would come into the office and have nervous breakdowns. I mean, it was one thing after another. There was the leadership was under such pressure because at that time, you have to remember that the FBI had made the Black Panther Party the #1 target of the COINTEL program. We didn't know anything about COINTELPRO per se, but it was obvious that the government was attacking the party in every way possible. It was obvious that it was just something strange. You couldn't, I mean, for example, you could not, work became difficult. To go and sell up the paper, for example. We would send people out and they would stand on the corner and be selling papers, and 5 minutes later they would be at the police station. Why are you at the police station? For threatening a police officer. How did you threaten a police officer? We didn't do anything. We sold the paper. It was the cops' word against the Panthers' word, and the cops would always win. So it was like, in every aspect, it became difficult. The breakfast program came under attack for supposedly showing little kids cartoons that were racist, that was said all white people are horrible or something to that effect. Basically, that was the general idea. Later, we found out that those same cartoons were manufactured by the FBI, were inserted in panther papers and distributed. I mean, that was the kind of thing that went on, but we, at that time, we were up against something. It's like you're up against this wall, but you can't see it, you can't touch it. You know that you're a target of the government's repression, but you don't know to the extent. We didn't realize the extent. I decided that I would leave the party, and I had not spent, I think, maybe a month outside, outside of the party, when it began to be obvious that I was the target of, like, the most extreme kind of surveillance that one could imagine. I mean, I lived on 138th Street. I'd look down in front of the building, and there would be two white guys reading the paper. One would read the paper for 15 minutes, then the other one would read the paper for 15 minutes. I decided that I would try to concentrate on my studies. I would just try to go on normal life, and then I would move. The reason that I wanted to move, because my whole house was bugged. And how I knew that it was bugged was that I was practicing on a tape recorder, something one day, and the phone rang. So I put the tape recorder down, and I go answer the phone, and a voice says, "Stop making tape," and hangs up. I mean, that was the kind of day-to-day thing I was dealing with. So the next thing, I mean, there was a big jump. The next thing I know, I'm walking down a street, and one of my comrades comes up and says, "Don't go home." What do you mean, don't go home? Do not go home. They just raided your house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They just raided my house. Do not go home. I mean, like, I was like paralyzed for some hours. It was real, and then I'm faced with a decision.
Police raided your house.
Mm-hmm. Go home, find out what it's all about, go down to the precinct and say, "I heard you just raided my house, and I want to discuss that." But I wasn't prepared to do that. I wasn't prepared to do that because of what was happening at that time. For example, the entire leadership of the Black Panther Party, 21 people were charged with conspiracy and were arrested and were put in prison. They were charged, and they were the New York Panther 21.
Conspiracy to?
Well, the charges were insane. They were like conspiracy to blow up department stores on Easter, the time when the stores are filled with black people. I mean, the charges were so insane that it got to the point that they were actually charged with blowing up or conspiring to blow up a botanical garden. The Bronx Botanical Gardens. I mean, that was the nature of the charges. And even though, after one of the longest trials in New York City history, a jury found them guilty in like an hour or something like that. I mean, found them not guilty, excuse me, in an hour or less. They spent 2 years of their lives in prison. They had a bail of $100,000 each. And at that time, the whole, one of the most common tools of repression that the government used was the conspiracy trials. They used a whole lot of other things. It later came out. But at that time, it was obvious that if you breathe wrong, you get charged with conspiracy, or you get charged with inciting a riot, and then they give you another charge of inciting a riot, or, I mean, and it happened not just to Bobby Seals, not just to Rap Brown. It happened to so many people.
So all of this was swirling around the raid on your house. So what option did you take? You said you had a couple of options. What did you decide to do?
I decided to make myself unavailable. I decided to disappear. They said that they were looking for me for the charge of harboring a fugitive. And that was what I thought was the charge outstanding against. And I never got charged with that, in fact, officially.
Why did you make yourself scarce? Because you thought that they were going to arrest you?
They wanted to, yes, I thought they were going to arrest me. And not only was I afraid that they were going to arrest me, I was afraid of what else, much more afraid of what else they would do.
Be specific. What do you mean?
Well, I was afraid that they would torture me, beat me. For example, Joan Bird, who was my co-worker in the medical cadre, had been beaten brutally. She was one of the Panther 21, hung outside of a window. If you see any of the pictures of her at that time, I mean, she was unrecognizable. The woman had been beaten beyond belief. And there was no guarantee that they would not do the same thing to me. And given the way that they were following me, all the things that were happening to me, I assumed that that was definitely, if not a possibility, a probability.
So you hid out. When was this?
This was in 71. I believe that this happened in about the end of 71.
You changed your appearance?
Somewhat, yeah.
You left town or you stayed in town? Okay, no comment.
No comment.
Right. How long did this continue?
Well, this continued for about 2 years. And
was a warrant issued for your arrest?
Well, let me tell you, what started to happen was that the government became more and more and more desperate in terms of their search for me. I think that they were under the impression that I had this wealth of information that they could beat out of me or torture out of me. What they did was they started a campaign to try me in the newspapers. And they set up a scenario which gave me very little possibility of remaining alive for much time. What they did, they began to charge me with everything and anything that any woman in the New York area was involved in. They began to charge me for things that only men had been involved in. And if they could not, if there was no stretch of the imagination that they could say I had been involved, what they would do is say, well, she planned it. Let me just clarify something. There were some charges. There was one charge that was out against me. I was accused of, in 1971, there was a charge of attempted robbery that was out against me. That was one that I was formally charged with that. It was later dismissed, but there was a charge against me. I don't want to give a false impression. But all of those charges that were the front pages of the Daily News, all of those day-to-day scandal sheet charges, I was never charged with officially. just imagine you. Tomorrow someone says, you're wanted for murder. What do you do? How do you deal with that? Either you turn yourself in and subject yourself to whatever may happen to you, or you run the risk of any cop, anywhere, coming and just blowing you away. Because once an accusation is made, then your life is worth 2 cents. I mean, and in my case, they set up a series of events that pushed me into the reality of that I knew that I had to leave the country. I had to do something because, you know, they were setting up the circumstances to just blow me away.
While she was underground, Assata Shakur became involved in the fateful incident on the New Jersey Turnpike, resulting in the killing of New Jersey State Trooper Werner Foster. Assata Shakur left New York with 2 men, Messrs. Clark Squire, who would be wounded in the shootout, and Zaid Shakur, also known as James Costin, who would be killed in that shootout. They all headed south on the New Jersey Turnpike.
We stopped to eat. At a Howard Johnson's restaurant. We ate. We got back into the car, and shortly after, we were stopped by the police, by the New Jersey State Police.
There must have been some dialogue between the 3 of you in the car, because you were, for lack of a better word, on the lam.
Yeah. Between the 3 of us? Well, yeah.
So you must have said something, you know.
Well, actually, I mean, we were stopped, but we did not think that there was, you know, we thought it was maybe some little thing, and that Sundiata was going to go back and show him some ID, and that it was a question of maybe we didn't really know. So Sundiata decided to go out and present the ID so that, you know, we can go on peacefully. And that was basically what was in our heads, although that, I mean, there were all the other considerations that registered in the back, but I don't think that we really were alerted that, you know, this is a situation where they're going to start shooting in the car. I mean, I was not thinking that, really. I said, well, this is, you know, I was nervous. I was like, okay, you know, but I didn't think that it was going to be all that.
Can you tell me what he said to you as best you can recall?
I can't.
Was it something, did he call you by name? Did he talk about, you weren't driving?
No. The driver had gotten out of the car. He came to the car and started to question me, and where were we going, what, you know, that kind of stuff. And then he said, put your hands, you know, in front of you where I can see them. And
which would have been the dashboard, I guess, inside the car.
No, I was facing him. You know, he had a gun in my face, and I put my hands out like this. And in a matter of seconds, I was shot. I mean, it was like a nightmare. It was like, you know, it's like when you dream. And it didn't seem real, but it happened.
There are many, however, who disagree with Miss Shakur's account. Among them, the jury who heard the case against her and found her and Charles Squire, her surviving companion in the car, guilty of murder. The superintendent of New Jersey State Police also differs with Miss Shakur. He agreed to be interviewed, where the prosecutor of the case, the presiding judge, the FBI, and the U.S. State Department did not.
Our troopers were on patrol. Werner Forster and Jim Harper. They saw an automobile, and I may be wrong on some of my details because it's been some time.
Yeah.
But the inspection sticker on that automobile did not match the license plate. They saw the sticker, they recognized it. They knew that the origin of the car was not the same as the origin of the license plate. They stopped the car. As they were questioning them, there were three people in the car, Joanne Chesimard, Clark Squire, and James Costin. A gun battle ensued. We charged Joanne with shooting and causing the death, being part of the group that caused the death of Trooper Werner Forster, who was murdered at the scene. James Costin was killed at the scene. Clark Squire escaped. We caught him locally about 3.5 days later. Joanne Chesimard was shot in the car. Trooper Harper was wounded. There was a violent exchange.
I was shot once under my arm and once from the back.
The bullet under your arm, where did the bullet come out?
It didn't. The bullet is still there.
It's still in you?
Mm-hmm. It went through here. It broke this bone, and it's still in my chest. I was, this hand was paralyzed.
Harper stopped the car. Forster came up behind. But Werner was completely removed from this kind of mix that would give rise to the argument that this was a racial confrontation. It wasn't a racial confrontation. Joanne Chesimard was one of the most sought-after fugitives in this nation. Every policeman in New York or Los Angeles was, in one way or another, looking for Joanne Chesimard. And now I'm convinced they were doing their job and doing their job properly.
The first week was the most difficult week. I mean, if you can imagine what they did when they found out who I was. They wanted information. They thought I had it. And they did everything that they could to get it out of me and to, you know, they didn't just beat me any old kind of way. I mean, they had a constraint. That was probably what saved my life. And it was what was taking place was in a hospital. They took me to a suite of a hospital. It was the Johnson & Johnson suite. Is where executives go. And in order to get into the hospital room, you had to go into a living room, which was attached next door. So they controlled who came in, who didn't. And I was accused of killing a state trooper, and state troopers for 2 weeks guarded me, quote unquote. And you can imagine, you know, they did everything they could. Every day was going to be my last day on earth. When they get next to the bed, and they cuffed me to the bed, and the cuffs were sticking in my legs until, you know, they started to swell. You know, where does it hurt? Does it hurt here? Does it hurt here? I mean, that was part of what happened.
Jill, let me tell you something.
Yeah.
I've been working with offenders for 35 years, and I can't think of an offender who would have been better guarded, or an offender against whom we would have guarded against any kind of improper activity than Joanne Chesimard. I think that it would have been foolhardy for anyone to have done things like that. I'm certain that the troopers who guarded her were not in love with her, but I'm also certain that those troopers were clear in their minds that if they didn't watch what they were doing, someone was going to take her away from them. And I've listened to all the reasoning. I've listened to all the accusations. I don't believe them to be very candid.
I opened my eyes and I was trying to adjust to the light, and I kept looking at something that was next to me, and I realized what it was. I was looking at a plastic bag, and that inside that plastic bag was they. And then I heard a voice say, if you don't tell us what we want to know, this is what's going to happen to you.
Sata Shakur was tried and convicted of murder by an all-white jury. She was issued a mandatory life sentence. Clark Squire, who was also in the car with Ms. Shakur, had been similarly convicted and sentenced in an earlier trial.
I was convicted of killing a New Jersey state trooper, which is a state offense. They transferred me under an agreement called the Interstate Compact Agreement, which says that they can take any prisoner in the U.S. and transfer them anywhere they want to. So they transferred me to a prison in Alderson, West Virginia, which is the federal prison for women, to a prison within a prison, the maximum security unit or something I was called. In that prison, I found that it was the exact opposite of all the experiences that I had seen in prison. In my whole time in prison, most of the women are black or Puerto Rican. The only black woman in the maximum security prison at Alderson, West Virginia. In a prison with the Aryan Sisterhood, about 11 or 12 members, people who wore swastikas on their jeans, who took pictures in giving the Hitler salute. I was in prison with them and with the Manson family. Women, they call themselves Red and Blue. One was Squeaky Frome and the other one was Sandra Good. And the Aryan Sisterhood, a few hillbillies, the Manson family, and one other woman who, Rita Brown, who was not she was a revolutionary woman, but white. That was where I was put.
Who threatened you against you?
Oh, of course.
She wasn't being set up. She was setting up. She wanted to come back to a Jersey jail that she could get out of. That's what she wanted to do. And she did it very skillfully.
Is it true, what she claims, that she was incarcerated with the woman who shot Gerald Ford, some Manson women, and some female white Nazis or something
I'm
like
not
that?
sure about the others, but she certainly was incarcerated with, was it Streaky Frome? Some name such as that, who tried to assassinate President Ford. But doesn't make any difference, does it? She was incarcerated with all kinds of murderers when she once got to Clinton Farms here in New Jersey.
Fortunately, this unit was closed down. Not because of any kindness on the part of the Federal Bureau, but these women were all white women, so that their considerations were taken into account, and they decided that that unit would be closed. I was then sent, first I was put in the hole for a while until they figured out what they were going to do with me, and after that they sent me to New Jersey, to Clinton Prison for Women. They sent me to the maximum security section of Clinton. But what they did was they told all the women, nobody from now on will be able to work in population, in the prison population. So all the women who were, had jobs or went to school with the other prison population now had no jobs, no schools, no programs, and were just locked down in that little area. And of course, you know, the cause of it, what was the cause? Her. They moved women out of that area who they thought might be somewhat sympathetic and flooded the area with women who were notorious rats for the prison administration. So I'm looking at all this, and I said, well, I think that they're going to try to kill me, you know. And the prison was constantly instigating things, you know. Well, if it wasn't for her, you know. So I decided.
You decided?
Yeah, it was time.
It was time. To
escape. To try to escape. And that's what I did.
When she was sent to Clinton, we knew that at some point in time she'd be rescued, and she was.
It happened on November 2nd, 1979. Miss Shakur broke out of the maximum security facility for women in Clinton, New Jersey.
And I say it wasn't an escape, it was a rescue, because people came in from the outside, assaulted that facility, and took her out. They took her from there to East Orange. We know that from East Orange, she eventually found her way to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and/or went out of the country and came back to Pittsburgh. I'm not quite sure. But if you are to listen to the testimony of James Costin, who was a witness, a cooperating witness in the Nyack trial, he put her on an airplane in an airport, probably JFK, and she was bound somewhere for the Mediterranean.
I escaped. It was a clean escape. No one was hurt. I planned it as well as I could plan it, and that's all I got to say about it.
How did you end up here? What can you tell us about that?
Well, I wanted to find somewhere where I would have a chance to be with my daughter, where I would have a chance to normalize my life, where I would have a chance to grow, to work, to contribute in some way to what's happening in this planet, and to try to keep up, to keep struggling on some level, and to keep active, to, you know. So I decided that I would come to Cuba. I came and I said, well, here I am. Now y'all got to make a decision and do what y'all going to do, because that was, I mean, you know, there was no way, you know, you can't call them, hi, can I come down? That was impossible.
My reaction is just the same as the reaction I'd have on any other criminal type that's found refuge in a safe haven nation, a communist nation. I think we've got to pursue that individual. We've got to exhaust every avenue possible to get her back here. She has been tried under our system of murdering a member of the New Jersey State Police who was in the performance of his duties, and she deserves to be incarcerated and to pay the penalty.
You ever think you'll come back to the States?
I think that would be difficult at this time.
Ms. Shakur attends the university in Havana and says that she will continue her activism. She's written a book that was recently published in the U.S., much to the consternation of some.
I think that it's offensive that a fugitive of this type, who really pledged, whether she meant it or not, or could have accomplished it or not, to overthrow the government in the United States by violent means. I think it's offensive to see that she's accessing the capitalist system that she has downtrodden, writing a book to profit from sales or something like this. So yeah, I'm offended by it. I think that if anything, the people of this nation ought to take that book and leave it right on the bookshelf.
Further, Colonel Pagano has written Fidel Castro requesting Ms. Shakur's extradition. While Assata Shakur pursues her life in Cuba, some in the U.S. are outraged about a number of points involving her case. Namely, her political posture, her role in the shootout in the New Jersey Turnpike that cost a state trooper his life, her escape from prison and clean getaway, and currently residing in political asylum in a nation greatly disliked by the Reagan administration. Regrettably, neither the U.S. State Department nor the FBI would grant, like it is, any interviews. On the other side of the coin, many of both races in the United States rejoice at her having escaped to Cuba, feeling that she was set upon by U.S. authorities for her political views. Engaged in the struggle for justice during the very same period of time that Assata Shakur was active. We're hopeful that their insights may help us in our overall understanding of the story of Assata Shakur. Ms. Dorothy Cotton was a staff member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and worked closely with Dr. King. She is now with the Cornell University staff. Dr. Len Jeffries heads the African Studies Department at CCNY and was actively involved during the 1960s. Ms. Gloria Richardson led an activist movement in Cambridge, Maryland during the 1960s. Currently, she's working here in the New York City area. And the Reverend Dr. Ben Chavis currently heads the Commission for Racial Justice for the United Church of Christ and was a political prisoner during the 1960s who in fact served time as a member of the highly publicized Wilmington 10.
Welcome to Like It Is.
What is your impression? What is your impression of Assata Shakur?
Well, Assata Shakur epitomizes the struggle. I thank God that she's still alive. And one of the most joyous moments of my life was the day I heard that she had escaped. And listening to her retell her story, it's a retelling of the history of our people.
Well, wait a minute now. Some might be outraged at you saying that. I mean, here's a woman who's convicted in the murder of a state trooper. That's a heinous crime.
Because he's a state trooper?
No, but convicted of murder.
But here's a woman, Gail, that was a target of COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program by the U.S. government to repress the movement. Keep in mind, there's a historical backdrop to this. At the height of the civil rights movement led by Dr. King, the government set in motion a government movement to repress the civil rights movement. And it reached its height in the 60s and the early 1970s. And so the reason why I have joy in my heart about Assata is because she survived it. A lot of sisters and brothers did not survive COINTELPRO. George Jackson did not survive. And countless others did not survive. So it's not a question of the allegations of what she was charged with or the fact that she was convicted of something that she was obviously innocent of. You heard from her own testimony is that she was in the car and that the police shot her, and yet she winds up being falsely accused of this crime.
Nonetheless, she does stand convicted. Aside from the actual shooting incident for which she's been tried and convicted, there are many who have problems with our members of our race who have pursued that course of action in seeking social remedy. How would you answer those who have problems? Now, you, Dorothy Cotton, worked with Dr. King, who had another approach to social remedy. How does the tactics and the beliefs of Assata Shakur strike you?
Yes, I still talk about the nonviolent approach to social change, and I do not tend to apologize. I definitely do not apologize for that. I do say that I always suggest that and urge people to look for other options, but before I say more about that, I'd like to respond to your earlier question. In earlier years, when I was more naive than I am now, I would probably come down on the side of, take a very negative approach to the charge and the allegation. But since the era that we're focusing on, since the height of the civil rights movement, and since the discoveries and even the confessions of how there was surveillance on people who were struggling for justice, since we know now what some of our basic institutions and organizations did, like the FBI, and how they systematically tried to sabotage that struggle, how they would disrupt peacefully planned demonstrations, I no longer accept the fact that a person is guilty even though they have been convicted. So knowing all of the subterfuge and the general oppression, which picture is painted so clearly by Assata, I have now to stand back and look at this whole system and this whole backdrop out of which she has come and emerged.
Ms. Richardson?
Well, I think one thing that I find very interesting is that she stayed underground for several years, and I would assume, had to have been in the New York area, as some of the other people underground were, and that the communities here did not turn her in, which I think proves that the majority of people that were interested in social justice, in whatever manner it was achieved, offered protection to those people that had put their lives on the line. I think it's very fortunate that, in fact, she did not have a gun to shoot the state trooper. I think if I had been underground, I may have been carrying one in just such a situation. I think she's a very beautiful woman, and she has matured from the time that she started studying the history of black people, and that they ought to be very glad that she's not in the country at this time.
Why do you say that?
Because I think that she would be a fantastic catalyst around which blacks who are still in misery would coalesce around and would trust, because she has laid her line and her life, and her daughter's, jeopardized her daughter's life in terms of what she was trying to do at that time.
Dr. Jeffrey, what's your response?
Well, I think it's very important, Gil, that you have had the opportunity to bring forth her story. And I think that Assata Shakur is in the best tradition of struggle of our people. And we need to fully appreciate that. That history has so often been hidden. The people who have gone up against this enormous system of oppression born out of slavery and maintained by all types of insidious means, we have to raise those people who have struggled against it. When we read, as a professor of history and our African experience, when we read her autobiography, we find a great deal of that truth, which is necessary, that she, a whole array of charges, as you pointed out, were erected against her, and most of those were dismissed, or there were no indictments, and there was a whole process of trying to destroy her. The fact that she has been able to survive represents that struggle of our people against oppression, and we have to support that. She represents a movement of the 60s and the 70s in which our youngsters now don't fully understand. And that 60s and 70s reflected the history of our people. There have been three major waves in which we have reacted against this enormous system of oppression. One, we've protested the system through what I call the accommodationist approach. That doesn't mean accepting the system, but moving against this system as petition and protest, lawsuits, etc. That's the tradition that the NAACP does epitomize. But there has been another major approach, and that has been some form of separation, built around nationalism, getting into ourselves, doing for self. And she was a part of that tradition. And then there was a third tradition that the Nat Turners and Malcolm X and others represent, which was a revolutionary thrust, and she was a part of that tradition. So she represents a very important part of our history that all of us need to understand and fully appreciate. And that's why I'm glad the book is here, Assata's autobiography, and also your work.
I was just making an analogy, listening to your comments, between earlier days in our history in this country, slavery time, for example, the time when black people were lynched more easily than they are lynched today, when often a black man could be lifted up, held up, lynched, destroyed, brutalized as an example, so that the rest of that particular group would remain sort of in its place. I make that analogy, between that and what happened to her. I think she was, a picture was painted, a whole scenario was laid out, as she talked about there, so that she could be lifted up as, as the bad one, and therefore we can cut her down, we can brutalize her, we can destroy her. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
No, it's very real.
That's clear in my head.
Yeah. I think that Assata Shakur is living history. She's still alive and still functioning. And I want to make a point about the fact that this African-American woman became a leader and became almost worshipped in some segments of the African-American community because of her leadership, because of her dedication, because of her life-risking activities on behalf of our people. Even as she talks now, it is clear that she has given herself, literally, to the struggle, all her own. And I think it behooves our people, and third world people and people around the world, not to lose sight of what Assata Shakur has already given, what she is still giving to this struggle. And I think that the fact that she is in Cuba, alive and well, still studying, and still wants to make a contribution. She kept saying, I want to participate. I want to get involved. I want to give some energy toward the ongoingness of the struggle. I find tremendous inspiration from this sister.
And I don't hear that desire to give as violent.
No, it's not
I
a
don't
question
hear
of violence versus
the very fact that she talked about being turned off with some of the language, for example, the use of language, the whole, macho presentation, of themselves, of the members, that she pulled away from that. So we should not jump to the conclusion, as I think some people would, and really get caught up in this whole, painting of this picture of a woman, holding a machine gun and mowing people down. That is not Assata. Right. And I'd like to make that clear.
All right, let's hold on for a minute. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more on this story. Tensions racially. and many view it as a tinderbox. What can the panel that is assembled here say to many whites who are deeply offended by anybody who talks about overturning the system of government in the United States? What can be said to a person who has that resentment?
I think that's, I think that's pretty impossible to overturn the system of government in the United States. I think the only thing that can be done is to make little small forays in terms of institutional structures. And I think that white folks that like to sit back and say that, it's like a put-off. They don't want you to do anything. So they're going to pretend that they think that a group of people can come in and without the armies and without whatever kinds of military assistance and overthrow the American government. And probably partially conscience, because they probably figure that we should really desire to overthrow it.
Is it an either-or? Is there one preferable way to struggle for justice? Is there one tried and true?
I don't think there's one way.
There's no preferable way, and I think, again, Assata Shakur's life exemplifies that. The struggle is protracted. And in a truest sense, she is a true revolutionary, because she has found that you don't lock yourself into one particular strategy on one given moment. That it's not only to survive, but also to move the people forward. I think there's a tremendous message that comes from Assata to our people in this day, Gil, and that is that we must first galvanize. She talked about the organizing at the grassroots level, and what she learned out of that. We need more of that today. We also need to understand that the whole collective leadership and how that leadership is carried on from generation to generation. Assata was answering the call of her generation. And the question is today, are young people answering the call of their generation to the challenges that beset us? We still have racism. We still have economic exploitation. We still have the contradictions of the capitalist system. We still have the contradictions of imperialism in the world. What and how can we answer the call of this generation? That's one of the messages that you get from Assata Shakur in this day and time.
In introducing you, I want to disperse the time fairly, but in introducing you, Dr. Chavis, I mentioned that you were incarcerated as a member of the Wilmington 10. Did you find that many people said that your politics had to be sinister? Otherwise, you wouldn't be in prison unless you were really politically a criminal or criminally a political
We ran into that. All political prisoners run into that initially, because there's an abiding faith, unfortunately, by too many African Americans that the system is basically just, that you don't get sent to prison unless you've done something wrong, that you are not accused of criminal conduct unless you have done something criminal. And I remind people how many times Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested, not because he was engaged in criminal conduct, because he was trying to change society. Assata Shakur was victimized because she was trying to change this society. So was the Wilmington 10. And I know from personal experience that COINTELPRO is not just something prehistoric. It is still going on. Right now in the community today, there are attempts to divide and conquer, to cause delusions, put false charges on people. And this is the whole sum total of it, Gil, is to thwart the struggle, is to not allow us to continue to progress. And so we must learn from history. I think one of the things she said in the beginning and throughout this program, history teaches. The history, the whole history, the compendium of history, not just the 60s and the 70s, although that's a very important period, but you cannot even lift the 60s and the 70s out of its historical context. We have a long tradition of struggle, and we must carry that on and learn from it, and extract learners and pass those learners on to the next generation.
Ms. Richardson, you or Dr. Jefferson?
Well, I had wanted to continue what Dr. Ben Chavis is referring to in terms of what Assata represents, in terms of a certain spiritual strength that our people have manifested, and particularly the black woman. And I don't think we should get into the question of violence or nonviolence. The struggle for liberation against the enormous systems of oppression involves any means necessary. And certainly one of our greatest historical figures mentioned. And she was in that spirit. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom, yet deprecate agitation, are men who want the crops without plowing out the ground, they want the rain without the thunder and lightning, they want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Power conceives nothing without a demand. It never did, it never will. And that's the mission of struggle that our people have to have as we map out an African future. And so we've got to understand that. She symbolizes that enormous struggle of our people.
But I don't think even if we speak about violence, I don't think that anyone involved in the struggle for justice comes to that easily or at once. I think it's on a continuum as you fight and you're blocked here, as you've used all of the constitutional tools or whatever that you're able to, and you're still blocked while that white oppressor is using everything, COINTELPRO, guns, whatever he can use against you, that at some point, if you continue that struggle long enough, that you're going to have to make some sort of decision in terms of the people that are either following you or in that struggle with you, because you're going to reach a certain kind of anger that's going to carry you forward.
See, I think, though, we need to be, I would be cautioned, because I hear people much younger than we are hearing some, you know, of those kinds of observations and translating those to mean that they should go out and, you know, and throw a garbage can top at a Sherman tank or something. I mean, that's how they translate it. I think that, as Dr. King's challenge does, that we need to continue to study and to look at ways we can use the nonviolent approach. And we must assume, come to know that that does not mean not challenging. On the contrary, the challenge is nonviolent resistance to evil, and that we must say that together. And I don't think we have broad enough concept, really, of what that is about. I mean,
Are you saying
mean
that the passive resistance tactic is the only tactic?
No, I'm not saying that any strategy is the only strategy, but I tend to come down on the side that says the end we seek is pre-existent in the means we use to get there. See, I've seen people who only hear and can absorb the rhetoric of violence more often than actual violence. For example, people often even lift up, say, Stokely Carmichael, for example, Kwame Ture, as one who was an exponent of violence. I've never known him to hit anybody. You know, I think we must separate the rhetoric from actually organizing a movement that has its foundation in actually implementing violence. Now, and one quick
Time is doing violence to our discussion.
All right.
Let's keep it short. Dr.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to understand that even when looking at the work that Dr. King was involved in, it was no longer a dream for him. He had moved way past the dream.
It was never just a dream.
Right, and it was a struggle, an enormous struggle in changing systems. And you have to change systems, and there's going to be a violent reaction in changing systems. And often violence is a part of that struggle, so we cannot look askance at the whole question of violence. We have to be total in our war against oppression and total in our support of liberation. And so we have to look at all the dimensions, and I think her story and what she is doing and what she represents now is an inspiration for young people, particularly because the aspect of struggle has been taken so much away from them, and we've been given music and we've been given other things that don't relate to what we should be all about. We have a duty and a responsibility and an obligation to struggle against oppression, to liberate ourselves, and help to map out a meaningful future for the world.
During that era, many said, argued that we are being mislabeled, that because we preach self-defense, we've been labeled as, you know, advocates of violence. Is that a valid argument?
No, that is not valid. And again, Gil, I think we have to be careful how we allow the larger society to label us, and then we respond to the label.
Yeah.
I think it's not racism violence, it's not poverty violence, it's not what's going on in the welfare hotels in this city violence. Was not violence committed on Assata Shakur? Did not violence drive her out of this country? Is not violence now, the threat of violence against her personhood, keeping her from coming back to this country? It's who is the author of violence? Was not slavery violence? Was not what was done to Native Americans violence? Was not what we did to Vietnam violence? And so the question, whose violence?
Right on.
And in response, I think that because a black man or a black woman says, I'm going to defend myself against the violence of racism, then all of a sudden, that our integrity is impugned. I think it's a question of the fundamentals, changing the system. American racism is fundamentally violent. Capitalism and imperialism are fundamentally violent. And we are the victims of these systems, and we're trying to change, we're trying to challenge that kind of violence. And I think we must, like Malcolm X said, we must struggle on all levels simultaneously. It's not choosing between Malcolm or Dr. King. It's not choosing between SNCC or SCLC. It is appropriating all of these different strategies toward a larger goal of social transformation.